The wind at 6,000 meters doesn't just blow, it bites, stripping away warmth and logic in equal measure until you're left with nothing but instinct. I was clinging to a granite shelf, my knuckles white inside thermal gloves, when her voice cut through the gale. Calm, low, and terrifyingly steady. "Don't look down," Elena said, her mouth inches from my ear, her breath a ghost of heat against my frozen cheek. "Look at me." I did. And in that split second, suspended over a drop that could kill me, I realized the real danger wasn't the mountain. It was the woman holding the rope and the sudden, inconvenient fact that I didn't want her to ever let go. 3 hours earlier, the world had been loud. The thrum of the transport helicopter, the shouting of the logistics crew, the chaotic transition from civilization to the wild. But when the chopper lifted off, banking hard against the slate-gray sky, it took the noise with it, leaving us in a silence so profound, it felt heavy. Base camp was a cluster of orange geodesic domes anchored into the permafrost, glowing faintly against the encroaching twilight. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of ice and ozone, a stark contrast to the humidity of the valleys we'd left behind. I shivered, not just from the temperature drop, but from the sudden, isolating reality of where we were. I ducked into the command tent, the heavy canvas zipper hissing shut behind me, sealing out the wind. Inside, the atmosphere was different, still pressurized and smelling faintly of propane and stale coffee. Elena was already there, standing over a folding table covered in topographic maps. She didn't look up immediately. She was studying the contour lines with a focus that bordered on predatory, her finger tracing a ridgeline I knew was composed of metamorphic schist, though she likely only cared about its stability. The dynamic between us had been established in the first 5 minutes of our introduction. I was the geologist, the academic, the one interested in deep time, in the pressure and heat that forged the world millions of years ago. Elena was the guide. She dealt in the immediate, in survival, in the physics of friction and gravity. She was authority made flesh, clad in weather-beaten Gore-Tex that had seen more summits than I had seen birthdays. "We leave at 0500, she said, finally looking up. Her voice was a low contralto, stripped of any unnecessary inflection. It was a voice designed to cut through storms. "Pack light. Anything you don't need for the samples stays here. If you can't carry it at a run, you don't bring it." "I know the drill," I said, moving to my equipment pile. I tried to sound professional, but my voice sounded thin in the small space. "Do you?" She moved around the table. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. "Stand up. Let me check your harness." "I checked it myself," I countered, though I straightened my spine as she approached. "I'm sure you did," she said, stopping directly in front of me. "But on this mountain, my check is the only one that counts." The space between us evaporated. She didn't ask for permission. She simply reached out, her hands finding the waist belt of my climbing harness. Her movements were purely professional, efficient, and practiced. There is a specific kind of beauty in absolute competence, a magnetic pull that has nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with capability. I felt the rough texture of her gloves against my hip, the firm, uncompromising tug as she tightened the buckles. She worked with a fluid competence, checking the leg loops, testing the carabiners. I stood paralyzed, trying to focus on the geological stratification of the valley walls, trying to recall the chemical composition of granite. Instead, all I could process was the scent of her, cedar, cold rain, and something warmer, like skin heated by exertion. She was close enough that I could count the sun-bleached lashes framing her dark eyes, close enough to see the small, pale scar bisecting her left eyebrow. "Too loose," she murmured, her hands lingering on the nylon webbing at my waist. She gave it a final, sharp tug that pulled me a fraction of an inch closer to her. The air in the tent seemed to thicken, charged with a sudden static tension that had nothing to do with the equipment. My breath hitched, a small, traitorous sound that I hoped the wind outside masked. Elena paused. Her hands didn't retreat immediately. For a second, just one heartbeat, she held my gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable, searching for something in my expression. It felt like she was assessing my structural integrity. "Better," she said softly, stepping back. The loss of her proximity was a physical coldness. I turned back to my gear, my hands shaking slightly as I sorted through sample bags. I was here to study stress fractures and pressure points in the Earth's crust. But as the sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon, plunging the tent into true shadow, I realized I was in trouble. The professional distance I relied on felt less like a shield and more like a cage. And we hadn't even started the climb. The sun hadn't even breached the eastern ridges when we moved out, the light nothing more than a bruised purple bruise on the horizon. The temperature was 20 degrees below freezing. A cold so absolute it felt less like weather and more like a physical weight pressing against my chest. But we moved fast. Elena set a pace that was punishing but sustainable, a rhythmic march that turned the ascent into a trance. The only sounds were the crunch of crampons biting into hard-packed snow and the heavy, regulated huff of our breathing. I was directly behind her, tied into the same rope team, which meant my entire world had narrowed down to the movement of her body ahead of me. And God, she moved. I watched her navigate the terrain, and it was like watching water flow uphill. She didn't fight the mountain. She negotiated with it. Every step was calculated, every placement of her ice axe precise to the millimeter. She read the snowpack the way I read stratification layers, seeing the hidden weaknesses and the solid ground that lay beneath the surface. It was maddening. It was intoxicating. I've always been drawn to intelligence, to the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly what they're doing. But this was different. This was visceral. Watching her stop to assess a potential avalanche chute, her head cocked to the side, her eyes scanning the slope with a cold, analytical precision, did something to my insides that the altitude couldn't explain. She would raise a hand, signaling a halt without looking back, confident that I would obey. And I did. I stopped instantly, waiting for her judgment, feeling a flush of heat under my layers that had nothing to do with exertion. There is a profound, dangerous intimacy in placing your safety entirely in someone else's hands, in knowing that their skill is the only thing standing between you and a 3,000-foot drop. It creates a feedback loop of trust and adrenaline that mimics arousal so perfectly, I couldn't tell where the fear ended and the want began. The terrain shifted as we climbed higher, the snow giving way to a narrow, rocky spine of wind-scoured granite. The path here was barely a foot wide, forcing us into a single-file proximity that felt suffocating. We paused at a bottleneck where the trail hooked sharply around an outcrop. Elena waited for me to catch up, pressing herself back against the rock face to let me pass through the gap. As I squeezed by, the space was non-existent. I had to turn my body, my chest brushing against her shoulder, my face inches from the collar of her jacket. The wind died down for a split second in the lee of the rock, and the sudden stillness amplified everything. I could smell her, the synthetic scent of nylon and gear mixing with the biting cold of the altitude. She was looking at the path ahead, her profile sharp and focused, seemingly ignoring the fact that our bodies were sliding against each other in the tight space. But I saw the muscle in her jaw feather, a tiny betrayal of tension that matched the sudden, erratic thumping of my heart. "Watch your step here," she murmured, her voice vibrating through the small space between us. "Loose scree on the downslope." "I see it," I managed, though my focus was entirely on the warmth radiating from her arm where it pressed against mine. I moved to step past her, my boot seeking purchase on a slab of gray slate. I knew better than to trust loose rock. I was a geologist, for Christ's sake. Rocks were my language. But the distraction of her proximity, the lingering ghost of her scent, made me clumsy. I shifted my weight a fraction of a second too soon. The slate under my left boot shifted, sliding with a sickening, grinding noise. Gravity took over. My foot shot out, and for a terrifying heartbeat, I was falling backward toward the drop. I didn't even have time to gasp before she had me. Elena didn't scramble. She didn't panic. She simply reacted with the same terrifying efficiency she applied to everything else. Her hand shot out and clamped onto my forearm, her fingers digging through the layers of my jacket to find the solid bone beneath. It wasn't a desperate grab. It was an anchor. She hauled me forward, using her own center of gravity as a counterweight, slamming me back against the safe solidity of the rock wall. The world stopped spinning. I was pressed against the granite, breathing hard, staring wide-eyed at her. She hadn't let go. Her grip was still locked on my arm, firm and calloused and possessive. She was close. So close I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, which were currently narrowed in assessment. "I told you," she said, her voice dropping an octave, rough with the sudden spike of adrenaline. "Watch your step." "I slipped," I whispered, the excuse weak even to my own ears. "You were distracted," she corrected, and she wasn't asking. She was stating a fact. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, then back up to my eyes, heavy and knowing. She knew. She had to know. You don't hold someone like that, with that kind of intensity, without feeling the electricity jumping the gap. She should have let go then. I was steady. The danger was past. But she didn't. Her fingers tightened slightly on my arm, a squeeze that felt less like a safety check and more like a claim. For 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity, we just stood there, suspended on the side of the mountain, the professional distance between us shattering under the weight of her competence and my inability to look away. "Focus, doctor," she said finally, releasing me slowly, as if peeling her hand away required effort. "I can't map the route and watch your feet for you." "I'm focused," I lied. She gave a small, unreadable hum of acknowledgement and turned back to the trail. I watched her walk away, watched the confident set of her shoulders, and realized with a sinking feeling that my focus was gone. We were approaching the first sampling site, a magnificent exposure of folded gneiss that should have been the highlight of my trip. But as I followed her up the ridge, all I could think about was the strength in her hands and the way she had looked at me when she pulled me back from the edge, like I was something she had no intention of losing. Night didn't fall so much as it collapsed upon us, a sudden, heavy curtain that extinguished the world beyond the glow of our camp. At this altitude, the temperature didn't just drop, it plummeted, stripping the heat from the air with a violence that made the very atmosphere feel brittle. We had descended slightly to a sheltered plateau just below the tree line for the night, a tactical decision to escape the biting wind of the ridge, allowing for the rare luxury of a small fire. The dry, twisted pine branches crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling up into a sky so crowded with stars it looked like spilled sugar on black velvet. The rest of the team, 2 logistics porters and the base camp medic, had already retreated into their tents, zipped into down cocoons against the freeze. That left the night watch. That left me. And, inevitably, that left Elena. We sat on opposite sides of the fire, close enough to share its warmth, but far enough apart to maintain the pretense of professional distance. The silence of the mountain was absolute. A vast, ringing void that made the snapping of the wood sound like gunshots. I was trying to write in my field journal, attempting to sketch the folding patterns of the gneiss we'd crossed earlier. But the firelight played tricks on the page, and my focus was entirely compromised by the woman sitting across from me. Elena was whittling a piece of deadwood with a knife that looked sharp enough to shave with. Her movements were small, precise, and mesmerizing. The orange glow of the flames softened the hard angles of her face, painting her skin in shades of amber and gold, deepening the shadows beneath her cheekbones. She looked elemental, like something the mountain had carved out of the bedrock itself. "You're not writing," she said, her voice low, blending perfectly with the hush of the dark. She didn't look up from the wood in her hands. I hesitated, my pen hovering over the paper. "I'm thinking." "You're thinking about the climb?" "No," I admitted, closing the journal. It felt safer to be honest about the work than to lie and have her see through it. "I'm thinking about the samples we passed. That ridge today. The pressure required to fold rock like that is unimaginable." Elena finally looked up. The fire reflected in her dark eyes, two tiny, dancing points of light that seemed to burn with their own internal heat. She set the wood and knife down, leaning forward, her elbows resting on her knees. The shift in posture brought her closer, invading the neutral space between us. "Explain it to me," she said. It wasn't a polite request to fill the silence, it was a command. She wanted to know. It's about trauma, essentially," I said, stumbling slightly as I tried to translate the geology into something human. "These rocks, they start as something else. Mud, sand, volcanic ash. And then they get buried. They get pushed down into the dark, crushed by the weight of the world above them, heated until they almost melt, but not quite." I watched her face, looking for boredom, but found only an intense, unnerving focus. She was listening to me the way she listened to the wind before a storm, with total absorption. "And?" she prompted softly. "And if they don't break," I continued, my voice dropping to match the intimacy of the moment, "they change. The pressure forces them to realign. They become harder, denser, more beautiful. That gneiss today, it's stronger than the granite it used to be because it survived the crushing. It's a record of endurance. It's beautiful because it didn't break." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was coiled, thick with a sudden, unspoken understanding. Elena watched me, her gaze unflinching, tracing the line of my jaw as if she were reading the stratification of my own history. The air between us felt charged, static electricity building before a strike. "Pressure and time," she murmured, the words rolling around her mouth like a tasting. "I understand pressure." "I know you do," I whispered. She didn't look away. For a long, stretched moment, the only thing in the world was the crackle of the fire and the weight of her eyes on me. It felt like a physical touch, a phantom hand brushing against my skin, heating me from the inside out. I realized then that we weren't talking about rocks anymore. We were talking about the things we buried, the things we survived, and the dangerous, beautiful pressure building in the space between the fire and the dark. The next day broke with a brilliance that was almost violent. The sun reflected off the snowpack with a blinding, diamond-hard intensity that required goggles just to keep your eyes open. We had pushed hard through the morning, ascending another 1,500 feet to reach a razor-backed ridge overlooking the great northern glacial valley. It was a place of stark, terrifying beauty, a river of ancient blue-white ice carving its way through the mountains below, grinding the bedrock into flour with the slow, inexorable weight of centuries. We stopped for a midday break on a flat shelf of wind-scoured basalt. The air was thin enough now that every breath felt like a negotiation, my lungs working overtime to pull oxygen from the emptiness. I sat on my pack, unscrewing the cap of my water bottle with trembling fingers, grateful for the pause. Elena stood 10 feet away near the precipice, looking out over the valley. She didn't sit. She rarely sat when we were on the move. She stood with her boots planted wide, her weight balanced perfectly, one hand resting casually on her hip, while the other shaded her eyes against the glare. I was supposed to be setting the glacial striations on the valley walls, noting the direction of the ice flow for my report. I had my notebook out, I had my pen ready, but the page remained blank. Instead of the geology, my attention was fixed entirely on the guide. In the harsh light of noon, there were no shadows to hide in. I watched the way the wind tugged at the loose strands of hair escaping her cap, the way the muscles in her forearm flexed as she adjusted the strap of her pack. There was a stillness to her that fascinated me. Most people fidget at this altitude. The adrenaline and the cold keep them moving, but Elena could stand as motionless as the stone itself, conserving energy, observing everything. She looked like she had been grown here, cultivated from the ice and the granite, a creature designed specifically for this hostile environment. I found myself wondering what it would take to unsettle her. I had seen her handle gale force winds, treacherous ice, and my own clumsiness with the same flat, unbothered competence. I wanted to know what lay beneath that professional armor. I wanted to know if her heart ever hammered against her ribs the way mine was doing right now, just from looking at her. I was tracing the line of her throat, the strong column of her neck disappearing into the collar of her jacket, when she turned. It wasn't a gradual turn. It was sudden, precise, and predatory. She didn't look around the landscape. She looked directly at me. I didn't look away. I couldn't. The suddenness of her attention pinned me in place. Behind her dark wraparound sunglasses, I couldn't see her eyes, but I could feel the weight of them. She walked toward me, the crunch of her boots on the rock sounding impossibly loud in the thin air. She stopped 3 feet away, blocking the sun, casting me into her shadow. "You've been doing it all morning," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a new edge to it, a vibration of curiosity that hadn't been there before. "Doing what?" I asked, though I knew. I took a drink of water to buy myself a second, the cold liquid shocking my throat. "Watching me," she stated. She crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, but with an air of appraisal. "Every time we stop, every time the trail narrows. You're not looking at the rocks, doctor. You're looking at me. Is my technique off? Is there a safety issue I'm missing?" She tilted her head, waiting. It was a challenge. She was giving me an out. I could claim professional concern, say I was worried about the route, invent some technical excuse about the terrain. It would be the safe choice. It would preserve the comfortable wall of guide and client that we had been dancing around for 24 hours. But the altitude does strange things to your inhibitions. It strips away the social filters we rely on at sea level. I looked up at her, at the formidable, beautiful reality of her standing there in the wind, and decided to let the safety line snap. "Your technique is perfect," I said quietly. "You know that." "Then what is it?" She stepped closer, invading my personal space, daring me to retreat. "You're dissecting me. I can feel it. What are you looking for?" My heart was thumping a frantic rhythm against my sternum. I capped my water bottle, setting it down slowly, deliberate movements to mask the shaking in my hands. I met her gaze, wishing I could see her eyes behind the lenses. "I'm a geologist, Elena," I said, my voice steady despite the lack of oxygen. "I study stress. I study how things break under pressure." "I know what you do," she said softly. "Answer the question." "I'm trying to map your fault lines," I confessed. The words hung in the frozen air between us, heavy and undeniable. "I'm trying to figure out where the cracks are, because nobody is this solid, nobody." For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move. The wind whistled through the rocks, a lonely, hollow sound. I thought maybe I had gone too far, pushed too hard, ruined the professional dynamic that was keeping us alive. Then, slowly, the corner of her mouth quirked up. It wasn't a polite smile. It was a slow, knowing expression that shifted the entire center of gravity between us. She reached up and pulled her sunglasses off, revealing eyes that were dark, amused, and burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the sun. "And?" she asked, her voice dropping to a husky murmur that shivered down my spine. "Found any yet?" "Not yet," I breathed. She laughed, a low, throaty sound that I felt in my chest. "Keep looking, doctor," she said, turning back toward the trail, but looking back over her shoulder with a gaze that promised consequences. "But be careful. Sometimes, when you go looking for fault lines, you trigger an earthquake." The silence that followed wasn't the empty, hollow silence of the high peaks anymore. It was dense. It was populated by the ghost of what we'd just admitted, a third presence hiking alongside us on the narrow trail. We moved out, abandoning the basalt shelf for the scree slope above, but the rhythm had fundamentally changed. Before, the distance between us had been a safety regulation, a professional buffer zone. Now, it felt like a magnetic field, a live wire, humming with a current that pulled at the iron in my blood. I walked behind her, as I had all day, but the observation was no longer covert. I didn't try to hide it when my eyes traced the powerful line of her thighs as she powered up a steep incline, or the way her shoulders shifted under her pack. And she knew it. I could tell by the way she moved. There was a new deliberation to her cadence, a subtle sharpness to her actions that suggested she was performing for an audience of one. The air around us felt thinner, sharper, not just from the altitude, but from the sheer, unmitigated awareness of being perceived. We stopped an hour later at a switchback to adjust gear. The wind had picked up, carrying a biting chill, but I felt feverish. Elena shrugged off her pack, rolling her shoulders to loosen the tension, and reached for her canteen. She took a long drink, her throat working, and then, without wiping the rim, held it out to me. "Hydrate," she commanded softly. I took it. My gloved hand brushed hers, the friction of the synthetic materials creating a strange, muffled intimacy. I held her gaze as I lifted the bottle to my mouth, placing my lips exactly where hers had been. It was a small thing, a nothing thing in the grand scheme of survival, but the heat of it flared in my chest. I drank, watching her watch me, and when I lowered the bottle, her eyes were dark, tracking the movement of my throat. "Still napping?" she asked, her voice cutting under the wind. There was a tease in it now, a low vibration of challenge that made my pulse jump. "I'm thorough," I replied, handing the bottle back. "I don't like missing data points." "And what does the data say?" She screwed the cap back on, her movements slow, deliberate. She wasn't looking at the bottle. She was looking at me, dissecting my reaction with the same clinical precision she used to assess snowpack stability. "It says you're used to being in control," I said, stepping a fraction closer, testing the gravity between us. "It says you like being the one who decides where we go and how fast we get there. But it also says you don't mind being watched while you do it." Elena stilled. A slow, dangerous smile ghosted across her face, softening the hard lines of her focus. She stepped in, closing the gap until I had to tilt my head back to meet her eyes. The scent of her, cedar, sweat, and cold ozone, was overwhelming at this range. "Maybe I just like that you're the one watching," she murmured. The admission was quiet, almost lost to the gale, but it hit with the force of a physical blow. "You're not scared of the mountain, doctor. Most clients are terrified by now. You just look at it like a puzzle you haven't solved yet." "I like strong things," I said, the words slipping out before I could filter them. "I like things that endure pressure. Watching you navigate this terrain, It's like watching geology in motion. It's impressive. Impressive, she repeated, tasting the word. Is that the scientific term? It's the polite term. Her smile deepened, shifting from dangerous to something warmer, something that felt like a secret shared in the dark. Careful. You keep looking at me like that, and we're going to have a very different conversation when we get back to base camp. I'm counting on it, I answered. She laughed, a low sound that seemed to vibrate through the soles of my boots, and turned back to the trail. But the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. We weren't guide and client anymore. We were two bodies orbiting a shared center of gravity, the pull undeniable and terrifyingly strong. We pushed on, the terrain growing rougher, the air growing colder. But as we climbed, the sky to the west began to bruise, turning a sickly, heavy gray. The wind changed pitch, shifting from a consistent howl to a chaotic, gusting shriek. Elena stopped abruptly, her playful demeanor vanishing instantly, replaced by the rigid tension of the guide. She looked at the horizon, then back at me, and the heat in her eyes was replaced by urgent, professional concern. The storm we had been outrunning had found us. The mountain didn't wait for us to find our footing. The weather turned with the sudden, violent temperament of a cornered animal. The wind slammed against us with every step, a physical force trying to peel us off the ridge. We were navigating a traverse that I would have called technical in good weather, but in this gale, it was bordering on suicidal. The ledge narrowed to the width of a boot sole, a precarious ribbon of limestone, with a sheer 2,000-foot drop on the left and a vertical wall of ice-glazed rock on the right. We were roped up, the 50 meters of dynamic nylon between us, creating a literal lifeline. Elena was leading, of course. I watched her move through the swirling spindrift, her form a dark, determined shape against the whiteout. She moved with a low center of gravity, planting her ice axe with a rhythmic, reassuring thunk that vibrated through the rock face. I tried to mimic her, tried to find the same purchase, but the geology here was treacherous, shattered sedimentary layers that crumbled under pressure. It happened in the space between heartbeats. I stepped onto a slab that looked solid, a plate of gray limestone jutting out from the wall. But the freeze-thaw cycle had done its work in secret. The moment I transferred my weight, the rock gave way with a sickening crack. There was no time to scream. The ground simply vanished. I dropped, gravity snatching me down into the void. My fingers scrabbled uselessly against the ice, finding no purchase, and for a split second, I knew the terrifying, weightless clarity of the fall. Then, the rope snapped taut. It didn't just catch, it jerked with a violence that knocked the wind out of me. But I didn't keep falling. Above me, Elena hadn't just braced. She had become part of the mountain. I looked up, swinging wildly over the abyss, to see her boots locked into a fissure, her body angled back against the pull, holding my entire weight with a terrifying, beautiful display of raw strength. She didn't struggle. She didn't falter. She just held. "Climb!" she roared over the wind, her voice cutting through the panic. I scrambled, my boots finding purchase on the lip of the ledge, my hands clawing at the rope. She didn't wait for me to do it alone. She hauled me up, hand over hand, using the leverage of her own body to drag me back from the edge. I came up over the lip in a chaotic tangle of limbs and gear, momentum slamming me forward. I didn't hit the rock wall. I hit her. We collapsed back against the safe side of the ledge, my chest heaving against hers, the impact knocking us both breathless. I was practically in her lap, my legs tangled with hers, my hands clutching the shoulders of her jacket as if she were the only thing keeping me on the planet. And in that moment, she was. The adrenaline spike was instantaneous and overwhelming. It flooded my system with a chemical cocktail that felt dangerously, confusingly like arousal. I could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched my own, beat for beat. We were breathing the same recycled air, faces inches apart, the vapor of our breath mingling in the small space between us. She didn't push me away. Her arms were wrapped around me, locked tight, holding me against the solid warmth of her core. It was a survival embrace, a necessary stabilization, but it felt like possession. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, her voice rough, stripped of all professional polish. I don't think so," I gasped. "Don't think, no." She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes wide and dark, scanning my face with a ferocity that made my knees weak. She didn't wait for my assessment. Her hands began to move, checking me with a clinical efficiency that felt searingly intimate. She ran her gloved hands down my arms, checking for breaks, then moved to my ribs, her palms pressing firmly against my torso. It was a medical check. I knew that. I knew she was looking for fractures, for signs of internal damage. But the way her hands moved, firm, knowing, sliding over the contours of my body with possessive concern, short-circuited every logical thought in my brain. I could feel the heat of her palms through the layers of technical fabric. I could feel the strength in her fingers as she squeezed my shoulder, testing the joint. "Nothing broken," she muttered, her gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to my eyes. "You scared the hell out of me, Sarah. You caught me," I whispered, the reality of it hitting me. "You didn't let go." "I never let go," she said. And the weight of that promise hung in the air between us, heavier than the pack on my back. She held my gaze for another second, the tension between us ratcheting up until it felt like the air was going to spark. The desire to close the gap, to taste the adrenaline on her lips, was a physical ache. But then the wind shrieked, a high, keening wail that signaled the end of our luck. The sky opened up, and the storm finally, truly caught us. The storm didn't just arrive. It detonated. One moment, we were standing on the ledge, breathless from the rescue, and the next, the sky simply collapsed. The wind screamed, a physical wall of white noise that erased the horizon, the drop, and eventually, the ground beneath our feet. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted so fast, I could feel the moisture in my nostrils freezing with every inhale. There was no negotiating with weather like this. You didn't fight it. You hid from it. Or you died. Elena didn't hesitate. She grabbed the front of my harness, her face inches from mine, her eyes narrowed against the stinging ice crystals. "We can't stay here," she yelled, though the wind stole half the words before they reached me. "There's a fissure, 50 meters back. Move!" We moved. Or rather, we fought. Every step was a battle against a gale that wanted to peel us off the mountain. I followed the dark shape of her back, trusting her navigation blindly, because my own senses were useless. The world had dissolved into a chaotic swirl of gray and white, a sensory deprivation tank made of violence. I couldn't feel my fingers. I couldn't feel my toes. The only thing I could feel was the tug of the rope and the growing, terrifying certainty that the cold was winning. Then she stopped. She dropped to her knees, disappearing into a shadow in the rock face I hadn't even seen. I scrambled after her, sliding into a shallow scoop in the basalt wall, a geological hiccup barely deep enough to be called a cave, but shielded from the direct assault of the wind. It was tiny. The ceiling was low enough to scrape my helmet, and the back wall was damp with ice. But the wind here was a dull roar rather than a scream. Elena was already moving, her movements jerky with cold, but still efficient. She ripped a silver foil package from her pack, the emergency bivouac sack. "Get in," she ordered, her teeth chattering. "Now, layers off, wet layers off. We need skin contact or we're going to freeze." The command cut through my hypothermic fog. Survival protocols. I knew this. I knew the physics of heat transfer. But stripping off my outer shell in a freezing cave with the woman I'd been mentally undressing for 2 days felt less like science and more like a fever dream. We shed our Gore-Tex shells, the stiff fabric crackling in the cold, leaving us in our thermal base layers. We scrambled into the bivy sack. It was designed for 2 people in a survival situation, which meant it was designed for intimacy. There was no room for personal space. There was no room for hesitation. We lay down on the foam pads she'd thrown out, the silver material crinkling around us, sealing us into a cocoon of reflective heat. The proximity was immediate and overwhelming. We were forced onto our sides, facing each other, legs tangled together in a desperate knot to conserve warmth. Her knees knocked against mine. My chest was pressed against hers. I could feel the shuddering rise and fall of her breathing, the frantic beat of her heart against my own ribs. The darkness inside the shelter was absolute, a heavy, velvet weight that pressed us even closer. "Come here," she whispered, her voice rough. She didn't wait for me to comply. She wrapped her arms around me, pulling me flush against her body, eliminating the last pockets of cold air between us. I buried my face in the crook of her neck, gasping at the contact. She was freezing, her skin cold through the thin thermal fabric, but underneath that, there was a furnace of core heat fighting to break through. I wrapped my legs around hers, my hands finding the broad expanse of her back, rubbing friction into the muscles there. "You're shaking," I murmured against her skin. "So are you," she breathed back. We lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the storm rage outside. It sounded like the end of the world, a howling, hungry thing that scratched at the rock, furious that we had escaped. But inside the foil cocoon, the world had narrowed down to this: the smell of warm skin and damp wool, the friction of our limbs, the slow, steady return of sensation to our extremities. The professional barrier didn't just erode, it evaporated. You can't maintain the distance of guide and client when you are sharing the same breath, when you are wrapped around each other like lovers in the dark. The cold outside was a lethal threat, but the heat building between us was becoming something else entirely, something heavy, undeniable, and dangerous in its own right. "Sarah," she whispered. And the way she said my name, stripped of titles, stripped of command, sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Her hand moved from my back, sliding up to tangle in the hair at the nape of my neck, her thumb pressing into my pulse point. "Tell me you're warming up." "I'm warm," I lied, though the shivering had stopped. I wasn't just warm, I was burning. "I'm right here." "Good," she exhaled, her forehead resting against mine in the dark. "Stay here. Don't go anywhere." "I'm not going anywhere," I promised. And as the wind howled outside, trying to tear the mountain apart, I realized I meant it. I wasn't just surviving the storm. I was waiting for it to break, so I could see what was left standing when the noise finally stopped. The darkness inside the shelter wasn't empty. It was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against my eyelids and filled my lungs. Outside, the storm was a chaotic, shrieking thing, tearing at the edges of the world. But inside the foil cocoon, the universe had shrunk to the few inches of space between us. The shivering had stopped, replaced by a different kind of vibration, a low, humming tension that radiated from where our bodies were fused together. We weren't just surviving the cold anymore. We were waiting for the spark. I felt the shift in her before I heard it. The rigid professional tension in her frame, the guide holding herself apart from the client, suddenly snapped. Her breathing hitched, a small, ragged sound in the dark, and then her hand moved. It didn't check for a pulse or a fracture this time. Her palm slid up from my shoulder, the rough, calloused skin catching against the sensitive pulse point of my neck before cupping my jaw. Her thumb traced the line of my cheekbone, a slow, deliberate mapping that stole the breath from my lungs. It was a question and a command, all at once. "Sarah," she whispered. The name didn't sound like mine. It sounded like a secret she'd been keeping for days. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I leaned into her touch, turning my face into her palm, surrendering to the gravity that had been pulling at me since base camp. The friction of the thermal layers, the smell of cedar and adrenaline, the overwhelming reality of her weight against me. It was too much. And it wasn't enough. She shifted, her other arm tightening around my waist, pulling me flush against her until there was no doubt about the intention. And then, in the absolute dark, she found me. The kiss wasn't tentative. There was no testing of the waters, no polite hesitation. It was a collision, a sudden, violent breaking of the surface tension we'd been careful to maintain. Her mouth was warm, tasting of the high-altitude ozone and the metallic tang of fear we'd just survived. It was deep, slow, and devastatingly thorough. I felt a sound unravel in my throat, a desperate, wanting noise that I couldn't suppress, and she drank it down like it was water. Her hands were everywhere, tangled in my hair, gripping my waist, anchoring me to the earth while the world spun. The competence that made her such a terrifyingly good guide translated perfectly to this. She kissed with the same focus she used to climb, precise, demanding, and completely in control. She dictated the pace, her tongue tracing the seam of my lips, coaxing me open, exploring the terrain with a hunger that matched my own. We broke apart, gasping, foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same heated air. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, loud enough that she must have felt it through our layers. "I have wanted to do that," I whispered, my voice wrecked, "since you checked my harness in the command tent." "I know," she murmured, her voice a low rumble that vibrated against my chest. Her thumb brushed my lower lip, swollen now and sensitive. "I could feel you looking. You weren't exactly subtle, Doctor." "I was trying to be professional." "You were terrible at it." She laughed, a soft, breathless sound. "But I didn't want you to stop. That's the problem. Every time you looked at me like I was a puzzle you wanted to solve. God, Sarah, it creates a hell of a lot of pressure." "I like pressure," I confessed, my hands moving to grip the strong muscles of her shoulders. "I like the way you handle it. The way you sound when you tell me what to do. That voice. It's dangerous." "My voice?" She shifted, her lips brushing against the sensitive skin below my ear, sending a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "The command in it," I admitted, the truth spilling out in the dark. "The way you take control. It makes me want to let you have it. All of it." She went still for a second, the admission hanging heavy between us. Then her grip on my waist tightened, possessive and firm. "Careful," she whispered against my neck. "You keep talking like that, and I might not give it back." "I'm not asking for it back." She kissed me again, deeper this time. A sultry, languid exploration that felt less like a storm and more like the slow, inexorable slide of a glacier. It was heavy with intent. I mapped the line of her spine with my hands, feeling the tension in her muscles, the solid, undeniable reality of her strength. There was no drifting lower, no need for it yet. The intensity of the embrace, the friction of our bodies pressed together from chest to knee, was intoxicating enough to drown out the storm. "Did you find them?" she asked, pulling back just enough to speak, her breath warm on my face. "Find what?" "The fault lines. You said you were mapping me." I ran my hand up the back of her neck, tangling my fingers in her hair. "I think I found the one that matters." "Yeah?" "Yeah, the one that let me in." She hummed, a satisfied, sleepy sound, and settled her weight more fully against me. The adrenaline was finally fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a heavy, satiated warmth. The storm outside was still raging, a distant fury that couldn't touch us anymore. We were entangled, limbs knotted together in the cramped space, breathing in sync. "Sleep," she commanded softly, the order gentle this time. "We have to move at first light." "Yes, guide," I whispered. I felt her smile against my shoulder. And as the darkness finally pulled me under, the last thing I felt was her hand, flat and heavy over my heart, keeping time. The light that woke us was violent, a stark, blinding brilliance that knifed through the small opening of the cave and shattered the darkness we had been hiding in. The storm hadn't just passed. It had scoured the world clean, stripping the sky down to a brutal, aching blue. But the primary sensation wasn't the cold or the light. It was the heavy, tangled reality of her limbs. I woke up with my face pressed against the thermal fabric of her shoulder, her arm a solid weight across my waist, locking me in place against the hard stone floor. There is usually a moment of recoil after a night like that. The awkward, stumbling retreat into apologies and the frantic reconstruction of professional boundaries. But there was none of that here. We didn't pull apart. We just breathed, the condensation of our exhalations mingling in the freezing air, creating a small, private atmosphere in the cramped space. She shifted, the movement slow and deliberate, and I felt the flex of her muscles against my chest, a reminder of the strength that had held me over the abyss just hours before. "Storm's broken," she murmured, her voice rough with sleep, vibrating directly into my ribs. "I noticed," I whispered back, reluctant to move, reluctant to let the cold world back in. "We need to move." She didn't move, though. Instead, her hand tightened on my hip, a final possessive squeeze before the guide reasserted control. "Base camp will be sending a search party if we don't radio in within the hour, and I don't want to explain why we're still in the bag." The extraction from the bivy sack was a study in reluctance. We peeled ourselves apart, the loss of contact hitting me like a physical drop in temperature. But as we packed up camp, folding the silver foil that had been our entire universe for the last 12 hours, the dynamic had fundamentally shifted. We moved around each other in the tiny space with a fluid, unspoken synchronization, without speaking, anticipating needs before they were voiced. I handed her a carabiner before she reached for it. She adjusted my pack straps without asking, her knuckles brushing the nape of my neck, a touch that lingered a fraction of a second too long to be accidental, sending a fresh wave of heat down my spine. The descent was rapid. We moved down the scree slopes as a single organism. Our cadence matched perfectly to the terrain. I walked behind her, watching her navigate the treacherous ground. But the observation felt different now. The competence kink that had distracted me on the ascent had deepened into something more profound. I watched the way she read the ice, the way her body adjusted to the slope, and I knew what those muscles felt like under my hands. I knew the taste of the adrenaline that fueled her focus. The mountain felt sharper, more vivid, as if the intimacy we'd shared had tuned my senses to a higher frequency. Just before the orange domes of base camp came into view, she stopped. It was a sharp, sudden halt on a ridge of wind-scoured granite. She turned, blocking the path, blocking the view of civilization below. "Sarah," she said. The use of my name still felt like a secret handshake, a code only we knew. "Elena?" She took a step closer, invading my personal space with the same terrifying confidence she used to assess avalanche risks. She crowded me back against a boulder, her hands resting on either side of my head, trapping me. The air between us was thin, cold, and electric. "I need to know," she said, her eyes searching mine, dark and unflinching. Was that just the storm? Was that just survival instinct looking for a place to land? Because down there, She jerked her head toward the camp. Down there, the rules come back. The protocols come back. If this ends here, on this ridge, you tell me now. I looked at her. The wind-burned cheeks, the scar on her brow, the mouth that had mapped me in the dark. I didn't map your fault lines just to walk away from them, I said, my voice steady. The storm is over. I'm still here. I'm still looking. A slow smile broke across her face, the same one she'd worn when I first challenged her. Good, she whispered. She leaned in, pressing a hard, quick kiss to my mouth, a promise, not a question. Because I haven't finished my research either. Back at base camp, the noise of logistics and debriefings was deafening. We stood on opposite sides of the command tent, surrounded by maps and gear. To anyone else, we were just a guide and a geologist, filing a report. But then she looked up, catching my eye across the room. Her gaze was heavy, knowing, and completely ours. A secret frequency cutting through the static. I came here to map the stone, to understand the cold pressure of the earth. I never expected to find the heat that survives beneath it. If you've ever found something unexpected in the wild, or in someone's eyes, subscribe to follow where this map leads next.